what are we actually architecting?
Which I feel is kind of just a loaded statement and maybe a weird, ambiguous thought. So,
is it the back end or is it the front end?
What for you is architecture patterns? What does that mean? So Cody, today we are back in the studio talking about architectural patterns, which I feel is kind of just a loaded statement and maybe a weird, ambiguous thought. So what for you is architecture patterns? What does that mean?
So I think the first thing to define within architecture patterns is what are we actually architecting? Much like someone who, let's say, was building a structure. The architecture of a mall is going to be very different than like a single family residence, right? So we need to define what we're talking about. And the main difference, at least in the realm of web application programming, is it the back end or is it the front end or some other tertiary kind of thing going on around that? And when it comes to the front end, we've got a couple of things. I'm just going to shout off a couple types of architectures that exist. There's the single page app, the SPA. There's progressive web applications, which are kind of a blurring of the line between an actual mobile application and a web application, so it functions a little bit like both. And then there's the classic static site, and those are pretty much the most popular ones to work with nowadays. On the back end, we've got MVC. If you've ever done any work in back-end programming, you've heard the MVC thing. It stands for Model View Controller. It's a type of layered architecture that has business logic separated from viewing logic separated from the data logic. And it's just a good way to containerize and what they call encapsulate the different areas of function. And that's kind of a monolithic approach, which kind of getting into another sub-subcategory is...
Sub-subs, okay.
Yeah, sub-subs. Subscribe. Sub-subcategory would be monolithic approach versus a distributed approach.
Okay.
And the difference would be MVC falls into the monolithic category, which means you have everything in one giant code base, basically. It's like a tower, a pyramid almost of sorts. And that's actually how it's described often when you come to back-end programming is you want to have everything structured up to a point, like a pyramid. A lot of logic on the bottom in the database, middle tier on that business logic in the center.
As you build up.
Yeah, and then as little logic as possible on the display layer.
Okay.
Whereas distributed programming, which has another buzzword associated with it, which would be microservices a lot of the time. And there's definitely a lot of other types of distributed coding and
we've talked microservices a little bit on another video, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But microservices are basically, instead of encapsulating them, the different functions of your code base in the same code base, but just in disparate layers that are all linked together as one unit of code running, it is an entirely separate code base for each function, and they all link together through a common communication topology, which would typically be like REST or I guess GraphQL or SOAP, even if it's an old school code.
SOAP. So good. So why would you go with one of these particular kind of architectural patterns or models? Like, why? Why would you implement this versus that?
Well, I think a first thing to ask yourself would be for probably how do you want to scale? Certain things are going to be better at that than others. If you have a huge amount of data to process and you need kind of a very adaptive, elastic system, microservices are great for that. But what they aren't great for is actually managing your code base because you have a bunch of different things going on. So there's really pros and cons on a lot of different stuff. Same thing goes with MVC. It's easier to manage because you have one team and one knowledge base working on one architecture, but your only option for scaling that is horizontally scaling it with servers, which is actually very complex. So you kind of have to pick and choose what your goals are as they relate to your business goals. Because certain businesses will be totally fine just pulling an out-of-the-box MVC type monolithic classic code and applying that to what they need to do. For most medium-sized businesses, that'll probably be enough unless you have a really high processing requirement. Now that said, it scales. Like same thing on the front end. If you have, let's say, an experience that is better suited as an app, and I guess we're not really quite getting into the idea of mobile apps, but that's actually more of a monolithic thing. But if we're talking about like a progressive web application, a PWA, if you want it to be sort of a mobile app experience or versus a web application experience, and you really want to fuse those principles, that would be your answer. Versus the single page application, which is more like, okay, this is actually an application with a user experience. They have to do stuff, and you don't really want to muddle with that mobile application complication, so to speak.
Yeah.
Bit of a rhyme there. That would be a good answer to that. And then, of course, the most simple approach on the front end would be the static site. You're just an informational content page or something similar in that realm. It's just nothing too complex. So I guess doubling back and boiling that all down, because there's a lot of phrases and verbiage to go along with that, is you really have to choose what you need before you know what architecture you need. You need to kind of roadmap, as they may say, and plan along that to figure out what the best choice of architecture is. Are you going to build a house or are you going to build a mall? You need to know that first.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even thinking of your project as a journey, because it is. You're going to start and you're going to end somewhere. Knowing where you have to start, where you're trying to get to, that's going to determine, are you taking a plane, a train, an automobile, a bike? Very different methods and ways of getting there, determining the distance and time and all that.
Absolutely.
Cool. Other final thoughts or conclusions that we either take into account, when we're architecting out these projects and trying to find the patterns, or good questions that customers could ask when they are trying to figure out what the best architectural pattern for their project is?
Well, much like a lot of things within technology or when you're building anything, is you got a plan. And a lot of times the plan for your project is your architecture.
Okay.
But the plan for your architecture is your roadmap. And that's the first thing you need to jump to, is to understand your own business principles and how they relate to technology before you start choosing just, I want to be a distributed application. I want to be a monolithic MVC. I want to have an SPA. You really won't know until you've actually gone through and assessed your own business goals. And that, I think, is the biggest takeaway.
Yeah. And that's not to say that you can't get from point A to point B in the airplane, but you may not need to. Car might be just fine.
No one takes an airplane just downtown. Well, I guess very rich people might.
Very rich people might.
But generally not. Generally not for most people.
That's good. Well, I appreciate, Cody, you coming in here in the studio, kind of talking through architectural patterns. I hope that we threw a bunch of buzzwords around, but I hope the takeaway for the viewer is that they have a better understanding of why it is important to go with a particular pattern over another, and also have some good questions to ask when they start architecting out their own project.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bixley Tech Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Chris and Cody, as they kind of gave a broad overview with a lot of lingo about software architecture and the different ways that a project can be structured and how they might relate to your business goals. If you have any questions at all about what we talked about today, go ahead and leave them in the comment section down below. And don't forget to check out the description box down below. We have a couple of really helpful links down there for you guys, including a link to our free custom software guide that will give you a lot of tips and tricks about how to plan out your own app or website idea. And you can also check us out at Bixley.com. And right at the top of the website is a big button that says Get Started on My Roadmap. And that will actually get you a free 60-minute conversation with Chris about your app idea. And he'll give you his advice, his feedback, and his expertise in that time. So we hope you'll check that out. And until next time, this has been an episode of Bixley Tech Tuesday.